Hello again. All right, so now we're going to do Module 12, and Module 12 is specifically going to look at the cerebral cortex, which is the outermost covering of the brain. And we're going to look at that and some of those areas more specifically, give you a couple helpful hints to try to remember, but remember we'll be doing activities in class to help you remember. All right, let's get started. I'm going to have to pull up the slideshow. Here it is. Hopefully this is it. Yep. Okay. All right. So we are going to look at the cerebral cortex. Like I said, this is so last class when we talked about the brainstem and the thalamus, and then we moved up to the limbic system. It's moving up physically when it comes to the brain, but also when we think of evolutionarily speaking, when we're thinking about what makes our brain different than other animals and having the critical thinking skills that we have and some of those abilities, this is really the part of the brain that's going to make the difference, and we call it the cerebral cortex. Within the cerebral cortex, there are 4 lobes, and each lobe has a cortex itself and has its own individual functions in the cortex. And then the remaining part of that region is called the association area. So we will talk about some of those. Some of those are more important than others. So we have 4 lobes of the brain: frontal lobe, frontal, parietal, occipital back here, and then the temporal lobe. It's kind of tucked under. And that's literally one of the ways that I try to remember it, is I physically touch the frontal part, frontal lobe, the parietal lobe's behind it, the occipital lobe is back here, and then the temporal lobe is kind of like tucked under. All right, and they all have their own functions. So the frontal lobe, it says here, it's involved in speaking, motor movements, judgment, and decision making. So one of the things you're going to find, it has a cortex, and we're going to talk about the cortex that's in the frontal lobe, but the frontal lobe is truly the part. We have larger frontal lobes, human beings do, relative to other animals. And so when it comes to that judgment, decision making, making rational decisions, that is going to be the frontal. The parietal lobe has its own cortex, so we're going to get more specific. It talks about, it receives and processes sensory information. So when we talk about sensory input, we mean all of our senses: smell, taste, touch, etc. And also relating to body position. We have the temporal lobe. Excuse me. We have the temporal lobe. This is where the primary function of the temporal lobe is going to have to do with hearing. What did I say? Do you need me to repeat that? I will repeat it. Hopefully you're listening, or that you can hear what I'm saying. The auditory information, and it comes from the opposite ear. So meaning when something comes in one ear, it's going to go to the opposite temporal lobe. And then the occipital lobe is for vision, primarily for vision. And it's the same thing. So if something comes in your left eye, it's going to go to your right occipital lobe. All right, so I mentioned that each lobe has its own cortex. So the frontal lobe, in the back of the frontal lobe, is something we call the motor cortex. The motor cortex is a specific region involved with voluntary motor movement. So let's all do that robot again. All right, so the part of the brain that's involved with that, even my voluntary like coughing, that is part of the motor cortex. All right, and one thing they notice that sometimes if you were to like stimulate certain parts of the motor cortex. It's literally certain regions of the motor cortex that we could create certain movements. So I used to kind of talk with students that, like, if I stimulate a certain part of the motor cortex, I can make you lift your arm. You know, it's almost like, what is it called? Simon Says or something like that. Somatosensory cortex. That is specific to incoming, like, body sensations. So as I said, if we were to stimulate certain parts of the sensory cortex, you would feel in different regions of your body, you would feel different sensations, and skin sensation and body movement. The auditory cortex is for, just as it says, auditory. Auditory means having to do with hearing, so receiving information from the ears. And the visual cortex is going to receive information from the eyes to help you be able to process what you're seeing. Damage to which of the following areas could interfere with the ability to plan for the future? Planning, remember, planning, judgment. It's definitely, we have a larger part of this brain than other animals. It's the frontal lobe. All right, and then, you know, we talked about this myth at the beginning of the year. Do we really use only 10% of the brain? Absolutely not true. We are using a lot of different regions, but when they did some original studies, they noticed that when they would stimulate association areas, there wouldn't be any type of response. And for some reason, they associated with that, mean that, like, we only are using about 10% of our brain. But one thing I do want to show you here is notice that the association areas are much larger in humans than other animals. So remember I had told you that there was a cortex. So we had the frontal lobe, and in the back part was the motor cortex of the frontal lobe. But notice there was a lot of the frontal lobe that's still left over, and that is called the association area. Most of the brain's cortex, which integrates information involving learning, remembering, thinking, and other higher level functions, is what we would recognize as being part of the association areas. But remember, it's not going to be the cortex areas, not the motor or sensory cortex area. So there's a cortex, and then there's an association area. There is a difference. The prefrontal cortex, remember, that was what I was just talking about. In forward part of the frontal lobe, it enables judgment, planning, processing of new memories. People with damaged frontal lobes may have high intelligence scores and great cake baking skills, but would not be able to plan ahead to begin baking a cake. So they're having that planning and judgment. And I don't want you guys worrying if some of you were talking about time management school, time management skills and planning ahead. Your frontal lobe is still developing. So that kind of makes sense that maybe you're having time management issues, because maybe that part of your brain hasn't fully developed. Like, you're highly intelligent, and you guys are going to do really well on certain tests when you study, but maybe that planning and judgment part is still kind of in working itself out. All right, so you need to know this famous story of Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage is, he was back in the 1800s. He was actually a manager on a railroad, and he was working with a tamping iron, and he was pounding it, and then I think something exploded, and it actually shot through his frontal lobe. And when I first saw this picture here, sorry, I don't mean to laugh, it's actually not funny at all. I thought it was just sticking through his, his skull. But this is actually just demonstrating where it went through, but it actually shot completely through his frontal lobe. And, this is a case study. Okay, so when we talk about, in-depth studies of a person, we were able to learn. Of course, we're never going to, volunteer and have somebody have this happen to them. But when it happened, they noticed a huge change in his personality. And he became what they said, like very ornery. He used to be very kind of mild-mannered and gentle, and he became kind of crude and, you know, just didn't seem to have as much planning and judgment skills. And as you can clearly see, it was through his frontal lobe. So they think definitely personality plays a part in frontal lobe. There are two other really important areas that are associated with speech. The language center in the left frontal lobe that has to do with expressive language. So speech, I think of a talking broccoli. All right, I know that sounds weird, but broccoli. So I just visualize broccoli talking, and it helps you remember that that's the expressive speech part of in the brain, you know, for speech. And then Wernicke's area is going to be in the left temporal lobe, and that is receptive language. So that's more of like being able to understand language and comprehend language. So last thing that we need to talk about is this thing called plasticity. So our brain has the ability to, especially during childhood, to reorganize, build new pathways. So neurons can kind of, it's almost like regenerating and reorganizing based on damage, but it's only certain parts of the brain. Okay, so obviously if your brainstem is severely damaged, there isn't really plasticity where other parts are going to take over breathing and stuff like that. But certainly the cerebral cortex, we definitely find plasticity. So taxi driver trainees spend 2 to 4 years memorizing all of the routes through London. And an Irish neuroscientist with her peers showed an increased size and portions of the hippocampus of this population. And the brain changes in response to experience. So one other thing too is, just as a quick side note, I don't think we had this in the slides, was they noticed that Einstein, they think that the parietal association area might be associated with math skills, because they also noticed that Einstein, when they did an autopsy of Einstein, looked at his brain, that he had a much larger parietal lobe. All right, in this image, most of the right hemisphere of a young girl's brain has been removed. This was very sad because of chronic seizures through her life. So they actually took out a lot of the right hemisphere to help with the seizures. And miraculously enough, the left side seemed to kind of take over some of the right hemisphere's functions. And it allowed her to still be able to move, you know, and so we just know that the cross-wiring, especially because she was younger, it was able to generate and kind of take over and help out where the areas had been removed. The ability of our brain to adapt to damage, where one area may take over the function of the damaged area, is due to, you guessed it, plasticity. You guys are so smart. Must be that parietal, mathematical, no, actually no, be the frontal lobe. I think it's the frontal lobe that makes you guys so smart. All right, although the brain often attempts to self-repair by reorganizing, it sometimes attempts to mend itself through neurogenesis, producing new neurons. So plasticity is helping kind of reorganize. Neurogenesis is actually producing new neurons. All right, here's a quick review. All right, the unresponsiveness of our association area has led to people thinking that we only use 10% of our brain, but we have brain areas are responsible for interpreting and integrating, acting on sensory information, linking it to stored memory. I mean, there's a lot of different brain parts. Think of all the brain parts I've actually talked about in the last 2 modules. And obviously, even you just listening to this, this flip video, that you clearly are having to use a lot of different parts of your brain to process, to hear, you know, to think about, maybe to write stuff down. So All right. Thank you guys. Hopefully, make sure you go through the form and the Google form and answer the 6 questions that go with modules 11 and 12. And I hope you have a wonderful weekend. All right. See ya. Take care. Bye.